There is a lamp burning on a writing desk somewhere in London in the early 1880s, and a woman is reading a letter she has received from a physician. The letter is handwritten, as all letters are in 1882, and the physician's hand is careful, the hand of someone accustomed to keeping records precisely, noting observations without embellishment. The woman's name is Frances Power Cobb. She is in her late 50s, Irish by birth, known in London intellectual circles for her essays on ethics and her campaigning work against vivisection, and she has been reading letters like this one for some time now. The stack on her desk is not small. The letters have come in response to a question she posed in the particular way that a writer and journalist poses questions, through published essays, through correspondence with physicians and clergymen and educated families, through the careful accumulation of accounts from people who were present when someone died. The question she has been asking is a specific one. It concerns a very particular subset of the reports she has gathered, cases in which a dying person in the final hours or days of life appeared to see and communicate with someone who had already died, not imagined relatives in general, not vague comforting presences, specific individuals named aloud, identified with apparent recognition, sometimes described in detail, and in a small but striking number of the accounts, identified by someone who had no way of knowing that the person they named was dead. She picks up the next letter from the stack, opens it, reads it through, then she sets it down and makes a note in the margin of the letter above it. The room is quiet, the lamp is steady. Outside, it is 1882 London, and something called the Society for Psychical Research is just now gathering itself into existence a few miles away, though she does not yet know it will arrive in the same year as her published work. The essay Frances Power Cobb was assembling from these letters, from these physicians' accounts and clergymen's observations and family testimonies, was published in 1882 in a periodical called Little's Living Age. The title she chose for it was The Peak in Darien. She borrowed that phrase from a sonnet. The poet was John Keats, writing in 1816 about the first time he encountered a translation of Homer, a poem about the experience of reading, and within it, a sudden image, a conquistador standing in silence upon a ridge of rock in Darien, a historical region of what is now Panama, looking out for the first time at the Pacific Ocean, spread impossibly wide below him. The ocean he had not known was there, the ocean that was, in the moment of that first glimpse, simply enormous and entirely new. Kabu took that image, the silent figure at the high place, the sudden astonishing view of something vast that had always been there beyond the ridge, and applied it to the dying person. The dying person, in her reading of the account she had gathered, was standing at a threshold, and in the cases that most interested her, the dying person appeared, in the final moments of life, to be seeing something on the other side of it, something they had not expected, something that made their expression change. The phrase peak in Darien is worth sitting with for a moment in its original context, in the way Kobe understood it when she lifted it into her essay title. Darien? The Darien Gap, as it is sometimes called now, a ridge of dense jungle on the isthmus between North and South America, was to a Victorian reader a place at the edge of the known world, a threshold geography, the place where the land ran out and something different began. The conquistador Keats imagined standing there had crossed an enormous distance to reach that ridge. He had not known the Pacific was waiting, and then, at the summit, it was simply there, wide, old, and so much larger than anything he had crossed to reach it. Cobb's essay did not claim that the dying were seeing heaven. She was a theist, and her private convictions did not change that, but the essay was careful in a way that distinguished it quite deliberately from the spiritualist literature of the period, from the seance and table rappings and mediumistic performances that were drawing large audiences across Britain and America in those decades. The spiritualist movement concerned her, and she was clear about this in her writing. She considered much of it fraudulent or wishful. What she was doing was different. She was collecting accounts from physicians, from professional observers, from people whose training or temperament disposed them toward careful observation and plain reporting. She was applying, as she assembled the cases, a simple evidential standard. Accounts were more interesting when they could be corroborated by a third party, and accounts were most interesting of all when the dying person named or described a recently deceased individual in circumstances where no one present had disclosed that death to them. That last category, dying patients naming someone who had died without their knowledge, appears several times in the cases Cobby compiled. The structure of those cases is the same in each instance. A death occurs, perhaps weeks before, perhaps days. The family or the attending physician makes a decision, sometimes for reasons of mercy and sometimes for reasons of practicality, not to inform the dying patient. The dying patient is already too ill for ordinary conversation, already at or past the point where such news would be processable in the way news normally is. The death is withheld, and then, in the final hours, the dying patient speaks. They describe seeing someone, they name that person, and the person they name is the one who died. These are the cases that Cobbe considered most evidentially significant, and it is easy, reading her essay at a distance of more than 140 years, to understand why. The other cases, in which a dying person saw and named a relative who was known to have died years or decades earlier, are moving accounts, and Cobbe included them, but they are susceptible to an obvious alternative reading. The dying person remembered the dead, thought of them, perhaps hallucinated them in a state of physiological distress, the dying mind returning to the most loved figures of a life. That explanation carries weight for those cases, and Cobbe did not dismiss it. But for the cases in which the dying person named someone who had died 3 weeks ago, someone whose death had been deliberately withheld from everyone in the room, that explanation carries considerably less weight. The question of how the dying person knew becomes, in those cases, genuinely interesting. Cobbe did not answer that question. She posed it. The essay was not a solution. It was an opening. She gathered the cases, laid them out, noted the pattern, observed that the most striking instances involved a specific epistemological problem. The dying person knowing something they should not have been able to know, and she named the phenomenon she thought she was observing. She called it standing at the peak in Darien. She called it the first glimpse of something beyond the threshold. The pages of the essay, as they appeared in Littell's Living Age in 1882, would have been set in the dense serif type characteristic of the serious intellectual periodicals of the period, a page dense with closely spaced lines, the kind of page a reader settled into, rather than skimmed, the kind of reading that belonged to the lamplit evenings of Victorian domestic life. A reader encountering the essay for the first time would have found, in the first pages, a tone they recognized, careful, educated, morally serious, disposed toward evidence rather than sensation, and then as the cases accumulated, they would have found themselves in the presence of something that the tone held very steadily, very deliberately, at a specific temperature, not cold dismissal, not excited endorsement, but the quiet warmth of a careful thinker who has looked at something real and refuses to look away. It is worth understanding what Frances Power Cobbe was not in 1882 to understand why the essay she published carried the weight it did. She was not a credulous enthusiast of the occult. She was not a grieving person seeking consolation for a personal loss. She was a professional writer and philosopher whose reputation rested on careful argument, whose ethical work had been taken seriously in rigorous circles, and who had, in the course of investigating this question, done something that the more sensational literature of the period consistently failed to do. She had gone to the primary sources. She had written to the physicians who were present. She had asked them what they observed. She had asked for specific accounts, not general impressions. And she had collected what came back with the same methodological care she applied to any other question she wrote about. The physician's letters on her desk were the foundation of that method. Each one arrived in its envelope, written in a professional hand, describing something the physician had witnessed at a patient's bedside that they had not been able to account for in the ordinary clinical vocabulary of their training. Not all of them were confident the experience meant anything beyond what it appeared to be on its surface, a dying person's disordered perceptions in the hours before death, but a substantial number of them had found themselves, at the moment of the event, unable to fully settle for that explanation. Something in the account resisted it, and so they had written it down, and eventually they had written it to Frances Power Cobbe. The process of assembling the essay from those letters must have been, at some moments, an exercise in careful comparison, reading one account against another, looking for the places where the reports converged without having any way of having influenced each other, noting the specific details that recurred across accounts gathered from different physicians in different cities in different decades. The recognition, the apparent surprise, the naming, the specific category of the recently deceased, unknown to the patient, the change in expression. These are the features that ran through the accounts in different handwritings from different parts of the country, and Cobbe noticed them and marked them and arranged the cases so that a reader could notice them too. Among the cases Cobbe compiled, one particular pattern recurs with enough consistency to have drawn her specific attention in the essay. A dying patient reaches a moment of apparent recognition, not a general sense of peace, not a vague impression of company, but a specific recognition, the kind of recognition that involves a name, that involves a relationship, that involves the clear sense that the dying person is encountering a particular individual and not simply a presence. The recognition is often accompanied by surprise. Not the surprise of something frightening, but the surprise of the unexpected, of someone appearing who was not, from the dying person's understanding of the world, supposed to be there. And in the most striking cases, the reason they were not supposed to be there is that they had died weeks earlier, and no one at the bedside had said so. The accounts Cobbe gathered from clergymen who had attended deaths had a slightly different character from the physician's letters, though they described the same events from a different professional vantage. A clergyman present at a deathbed was trained to attend to spiritual matters, to the dying person's state of mind and soul, and was therefore more likely to have noted and recorded a dying person's spoken observations about what they were seeing. Cobbe's method of drawing on both sources, the clinical observation of the physician and the more intimate pastoral attention of the clergyman, gave the compiled cases a kind of stereoscopic quality, two perspectives on the same phenomenon from different angles of professional attention. The family testimony she included added a third angle. Family members present at a death were not trained observers in any formal sense, but they were present, they were attentive, and they were often the people most likely to know the specific relational significance of any name the dying person spoke. A physician could record that the patient had named a deceased individual, but a family member could confirm that the patient had not been informed of that death, could place the death in its precise temporal relationship to the events at the bedside, could speak to the exact conversation or absence of conversation that had taken place in the corridor outside the patient's door. These three sources, physician, clergyman, family, working together in a single case, produced the kind of corroborated account that Cobb's evidential standard required. She was not interested in isolated reports that could not be checked. She was interested in cases where multiple independent observers could confirm the basic facts, where the information barrier, the deliberate withholding of a death from the dying patient, could be established with some confidence, and where the dying person's naming of the recently deceased could therefore not be easily reduced to prior knowledge or recent conversation. The word threshold appears in Cobb's essay, and it is the right word for the conceptual territory she was working in. The threshold is not a place, it is a relationship between two places, the place you are standing and the place you cannot yet see. The dying room in the Victorian household was, in Cobbe's reading, such a threshold space, a room from which the next territory was becoming visible, or so the accounts she had gathered seemed to suggest. The image she returned to, the peak in Darien, carries that same quality. The peak is not the ocean, it is the high point from which the ocean becomes visible for the first time. The experience it describes is not arrival, but the moment of first sight. What the Victorian cultural context added to this, what 1882 London brought to Cobbe's investigation, that a contemporary researcher might find less present in their own setting, was a particular relationship to dying as a domestic event. People in the 1880s died far more commonly than in the 21st century, at home, in their own beds, surrounded by family members, and attended by physicians who made house calls and sat with patients through the night. Death was a room in the house. It was witnessed. It was attended. The dying person's final words and expressions were observed and remembered and spoken of afterward in a way that made Cobbe's method of collection, letters asking what physicians and clergymen and families had seen at deathbeds, a practical research strategy rather than an unusual one. The accounts she received were, in many cases, accounts of events that had been retained in family memory across years or even decades, spoken of quietly, not publicized or dramatized, held by the people who witnessed them as things that were real and yet not easily placed within any explanatory framework they possessed. The physician who had attended the death of a patient who named a recently deceased relative and then died peacefully had filed the case somewhere in his professional memory between the explicable and the inexplicable, and had not done much with it beyond noting it and carrying it. When Cobbe's inquiry arrived, it gave that physician a place to send the account. It said, in effect, "This question has been asked, and your observation belongs to it." The essays of Frances Power Cobbe were known, in 1882, to reach educated readers across Britain and the English-speaking world, and Lyda's Living Age had a readership that included serious intellectual figures on both sides of the Atlantic. The essay did not pass unnoticed. It was read, discussed, circulated, the way serious essays circulated in a period when a well-regarded article in an intellectual periodical could move through educated society with some velocity. And in the same year of its publication, 1882, something was happening at 14 Dean's Yard in Westminster, in rooms near the chapter house of Westminster Abbey, where a group of men were assembling for a purpose that would have interested Cobbe very much. These men were not mystics or spiritualists. They were scholars, scientists, classicists, and philosophers who had been drawn together by a shared conviction that certain questions, apparitions, hallucinations, crisis experiences, the persistence of the self after bodily death, were questions that deserved rigorous investigation rather than either credulous acceptance or reflexive dismissal. Their names were Henry Sidgwick, Edmund Gurney, Frederic Myers, William Barrett, and others. Their institutional frame was the Society for Psychical Research, and they founded it in 1882. The founding of the Society for Psychical Research in the same year that Cobb published The Peak in Darien was not precisely a coincidence, in the sense that both events arose from the same cultural moment, a moment in which Victorian intellectual culture was finding itself pressed between the receding authority of established religion and the advancing claims of scientific materialism, and was looking with considerable interest and variable rigor at the experiences that seemed to fall between those two explanatory systems. But the specific convergence, Cobb's essay, and the Society's founding in the same 12 months has a particular interest because of what happened next. The men at 14 Dean's Yard received Cobb's essay. It circulated among them. Frederic Myers, who had trained as a classical scholar at Cambridge and was now turning his formidable intellectual energy toward what he called psychical research, and read the cases she had compiled with the attention of someone looking for the evidential skeleton of the accounts, the specific logical structure that made a particular case more or less susceptible to ordinary explanation. Edmund Gurney, who had studied music and medicine before arriving at the Society's founding concerns, brought to the reading the sensibility of someone accustomed to following an argument carefully and noting where the evidence was strong and where it was thin. William Barrett, a physicist at the Royal College of Science in Dublin, who had arrived at psychical research through his own experiences and observations, recognized in Cobb's compiled cases a pattern he had encountered independently and considered evidentially significant. These men had not waited for Cobb's essay to begin their investigations, but the essay gave them what systematic investigators always need: a set of documented cases, gathered with care, described in enough detail to permit analysis, and organized around a specific evidential question. The question Cobb had posed, how does a dying person name someone who died 3 weeks ago without being told, was not a vague question about the afterlife. It was a specific, empirical, investigable question about information and its sources. And that kind of question was exactly what the Society for Psychical Research in 1882 was constituting itself to pursue. Henry Sidgwick, the Society's first president, was a philosopher, a moral philosopher of considerable distinction, a man who had resigned his Cambridge fellowship rather than subscribe to the 39 Articles, a person for whom intellectual honesty was not an aspiration but a discipline. He brought to the founding of the Society the same scruple he brought to everything, the insistence that the question be held open, that no conclusion be reached before the evidence warranted it, and that the standard of evidence be higher, if anything, than the standard applied in less contested territories of inquiry. Cobb's essay, held against that standard, represented something useful, a body of cases gathered with some care by a reliable reporter from sources with independent standing, not proof of anything, but a beginning. The image of Cobb's pamphlet, the essay as it was eventually circulated separately from its original periodical home, arriving on a desk at 14 Dean's Yard in 1882, is an image of something being received and taken seriously. The pamphlet would have been passed from hand to hand as things were passed in those first society meetings, annotated and discussed, its cases compared against other cases already in circulation, its evidential quality assessed against the standard these men were in the process of establishing. Frederic Myers would have read it and found in it the specific type of case, the dying person naming the recently deceased, unknown to them, that he would later classify, in his own terminology, as a veridical experience. Gurney would have noted the methodology and asked, as he always did, whether the corroboration was sufficient. Barrett, already familiar with similar accounts from his own investigations, would have recognized the pattern. What moved through those rooms in 1882, passing from hand to hand in the lamplight of early December meetings, was the particular quality of intellectual attention that a serious question attracts when it encounters serious people who are willing to stay with it. Cobby had named the question by naming the image, the peak, the threshold, the first glimpse of the enormous thing on the other side. She had gathered the cases that gave the question its evidential weight, and the men at 14 Dean's Yard had constituted themselves in the same year for the purpose of pursuing exactly this kind of question, following the evidence carefully, holding the conclusion open, refusing both the comfort of dismissal and the ease of belief. What 1882 produced in those two separate gatherings of serious attention was not an answer, it was a methodology, a way of approaching the question, a standard for what counted as a significant case and what made a case interesting rather than merely reported. The essay provided the frame and the first substantial collection of accounts. The society provided the institutional structure and the trained analytical attention. Together, they established that this was a question worth asking carefully, and that asking it carefully was different in important ways, both from dismissing it and from believing it. The research program that followed, in the decades after 1882, was built on the foundation those two separate institutions laid in the same 12 months. The essay from a careful journalist and philosopher asking what the accounts seemed to show, and the new society of scholars and scientists asking how those accounts could be tested. They arrived at the question from different angles. They brought different tools, but they arrived in the same year, and they found, in that convergence, something to work with together. Francis Power Cobb's writing desk in the early 1880s, the lamp burning, the stack of letters, the pages of the accumulating essay in her handwriting, was the place where the question was given its name. The peak in Darien, the high threshold, the first look at the enormous thing that had always been waiting on the other side. She named it from a poem about the act of reading, about the experience of encountering something that opens the world wider than it was before, and that naming was precise in the way that the best essay titles are precise. It contained the argument, the dying person at the threshold, seeing for the first time what lay beyond it, the standing still in the sudden wideness of the view. The essay was published. It was read. It crossed the desks of physicians and clergymen and educated families, and eventually arrived at the rooms where a group of men had recently constituted themselves to investigate exactly this kind of question. Two groups of serious people in the same 12 months of 1882 decided that this was worth pursuing carefully. One named the question, the other built the apparatus to follow it. In the cases, the letters on Cobby's desk, the accounts in their careful handwriting, the dying patients naming the recently dead, moved from her hands into theirs, and the inquiry began. The lamp on the writing desk goes on burning for a moment longer. The letters are stacked. The margins are annotated. The essay has been sent. Outside, it is the same year the society opened its first meeting rooms, and somewhere in Westminster, the pamphlet is already in circulation, passing from one careful reader's hands to another, finding its way to the desks of men who had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this kind of question, to arrive in exactly this kind of form. That is what 1882 held in those two quiet places, a named question and the beginning of the long work of following it. Two separate undertakings in the same short year, deciding together, without yet having met, that some things were worth sitting with, not because the answer was visible from the peak, but because the view from there was wider than anything they had expected, and they were, all of them, the kind of people who did not look away. In the corridor outside the maternity ward, three people reached a quiet agreement. The year was somewhere in the early 1920s. The place was a hospital in London, and the woman inside the room, the woman they had come to be near, was dying from complications following the birth of her child. Her name was Doris. Her sister Vida had died 3 weeks earlier, suddenly, from an illness no one had anticipated, and the family standing in that corridor had made the decision, carefully and with deliberate tenderness, not to tell her. Doris had not known when she went into labor. She did not know now. The agreement held between them as they returned to the room, and nothing in their manner, as far as they could tell, had given anything away. What happened in the hours that followed was witnessed by Lady Florence Barrett, the obstetric surgeon attending the case. Lady Barrett was a trained physician, methodical, professionally skeptical, accustomed to the physical facts of her work, and she recorded what she observed with the precision of someone who understood that what she was writing down would be examined. Doris had been peaceful, she noted. Then something shifted in the dying woman's attention. She appeared to see her father among the figures she described, an expected presence, a comfort, and then her expression changed again to something that Lady Barrett characterized as surprise. Doris named her sister Vida, not with uncertainty, not as a question, but with the specific quality of recognition that belongs to encountering someone in an unexpected place. The family in the room heard her say it. Lady Barrett heard her say it. The physicians and nurses present heard it. And what made the moment evidentially significant, what Lady Barrett returned to in her professional notes, and would continue to return to for years, was not the vision itself, which could be attributed to any number of physiological causes, but the particular character of that surprise. Doris had not expected Vida to be there. She had not known Vida was dead. Whatever Doris believed about the world in her final hours, she had believed her sister was still alive, and the expression on her face when she named her was not recognition of someone expected, but recognition of someone whose presence could not have been accounted for in any world where Vida was still living. Lady Barrett's account was written into her professional records in the immediate aftermath of the case. She preserved it carefully, with the names, the dates, the details of the information barrier the family had maintained, and the sequence of what Doris had said and in what order. When her husband, the physicist Sir William Barrett, died in 1925, the book he had spent his later years compiling, a collection of deathbed vision accounts gathered from physicians, nurses, and family members across several decades, was nearly complete. Lady Barrett saw it through to publication. Deathbed Visions appeared in 1926, and the case of Doris occupied its opening pages, described in the measured language of someone who had been present and who considered the detail of the surprise, the naming of Vida, the unprepared recognition, to be the thing the account could not do without. Sir William Barrett had been drawn to this subject long before Doris. He was a physicist by training, a fellow of the Royal Society, a man whose professional life had been spent in the careful study of material phenomena, and he had spent years collecting accounts from witnesses he considered credible, medical professionals, clergymen, family members who had been at the bedside and who had written down what they observed. His standard was not proof of the supernatural. His standard was the quality of the testimony, the conditions under which the observation was made, and whether any account could be verified against external evidence. The Doris case, when Lady Barrett brought it to him, met all three conditions. The information barrier was confirmable. The timing of Vita's death was a matter of record, and the person who had reported the vision was a trained physician who had been standing in the room. The book itself was not long. It gathered the cases Barrett had considered most carefully documented, organized them by evidential quality, and placed the Doris case at the center of the argument, not because it was the most dramatic, but because it was the most specific. A vision of a relative was one thing. A vision of a relative whose death was unknown to the dying person, with surprise at that relative's presence recorded by a medical professional in the room, was something else. Barrett had a name for this kind of case, borrowed from a writer who had worked the same territory 40 years earlier. He called them, following Francis Power Cove, cases of the Peak and Darien type. The name carried with it the image she had chosen, the moment of seeing something vast and unexpected from a high place, and it carried the evidential standard she had applied, not the vision alone, but the vision of someone who could not, by any ordinary accounting, have been expected to be there. Across the Atlantic, and across several decades, a different kind of investigation was taking shape. The project was systematic, in a way that individual case collection could not be. It involved surveys rather than gathered accounts, questionnaires rather than letters, and it was conducted simultaneously across two countries whose cultural frameworks for death and dying were in many respects entirely distinct. The researchers were Carlos Osis and Erlander Haraldsson. The year the study was published was 1977, and the scope of what they had assembled, close to 1,000 physicians and nurses surveyed in the United States, close to 700 in India, gave the results a weight that a single case, however carefully documented, could never carry on its own. Osis had been working in this field since the 1960s, gathering data on end-of-life experiences with a researcher's patience and a statistician's attention to distribution. What he and Haraldsson were looking for was not the extraordinary case, but the ordinary pattern, the baseline description that appeared across dozens and hundreds of accounts, the consistent detail that persisted regardless of who was reporting it or where. And what the data returned, with a consistency that the researchers described as striking, was the same figure again and again, not a stranger, not an angel from a religious tradition, not a figure shaped by medication or by the specific geography of the dying person's imagination. A relative, specifically a deceased relative. The pattern held across the American dataset and across the Indian dataset, and when Osis and Haraldsson set the two sets of results beside each other, the convergence was not what a purely culturally constructed hallucination model would have predicted. The survey forms themselves were careful instruments. They asked physicians and nurses to describe what they had witnessed, not what they believed it meant, not what they thought had caused it, but what they had observed, what the patient had said, what the patient's expression had been, whether the content of the vision had been communicated to the medical staff, and if so, in what words, whether the patient had named the figure they described, and in a specific and important subset of cases, whether there was any possibility that the patient had received information about the figure's death through ordinary channels, through conversation, through a newspaper, through a letter, through anything that could account for the knowledge the patient appeared to have. It was within this subset that Osis and Haraldsson found what they considered the most evidentially significant cases in their entire data set. These were the accounts in which a dying patient had, apparently without advance knowledge, identified by name and with apparent surprise, a figure whose death had been deliberately withheld from them. The same structure precisely as the case of Doris and her sister Vida, replicated across different institutions, different countries, different decades, different patients, different physicians and nurses, filling out different survey forms with different handwriting in different rooms. Osis and Haraldson did not choose a new name for this category. They had a name already, and they used it with deliberate acknowledgement of where it came from. They called these cases of the Peak and Darien type, borrowing the phrase directly from Cubby, connecting their 1977 dataset explicitly to the intellectual tradition she had established nearly a century before. A nurse's handwriting on a survey questionnaire in 1971 describes what she had seen the previous winter. The account occupies a few lines of a printed form, the handwriting slightly uneven toward the right margin, where the pen had reached the edge of the box. The patient had been lying quietly. Then his gaze had moved, deliberately, the nurse noted, not restlessly, not with the unfocused quality of confusion, but with the directed quality of attention, fixed on something specific. He turned his head toward the upper left corner of the room. His expression changed. The nurse's word for the change was peace, and she returned to it twice in the same short paragraph, as though the inadequacy of a single mention was clear to her. Then the patient spoke a name. The nurse had not recognized the name. She recorded it phonetically and noted it in the margin of the form. Two of the patient's family members, when contacted by the research team through the hospital's records, confirmed that the name belonged to the patient's older brother, who had died 8 months earlier. The family had not told the patient. They had agreed, in the way that Doris's family had agreed in that corridor outside the maternity ward, that the news would cause him additional distress at a time when he was already failing. The patient, as far as anyone could confirm, had not known. The questionnaire from this case was placed in a file folder. The file folder was numbered and added to the stack. The stack became, over the course of several years, an archive cross-referenced against hospital admission records, against family interview notes, against the documented communications that had and had not taken place between patients and their visitors. Osis and Haraldson were methodical about the cross-referencing. They wanted the information barriers to be confirmable, not assumed. In the subset of cases they classified as Peak and Darien type, they required that the absence of communicated information be established through independent documentation, wherever possible, through medical notes, through family testimony, through the visiting records that some hospitals maintained. The cases that remained in the category after this screening were fewer than the total data set, but they were, by the researchers' own assessment, the ones they found most difficult to account for within a model of vision content shaped entirely by the dying person's existing knowledge. What the nurses in the Osis Haraldson study described, across American hospitals and Indian hospitals alike, carried a quality that appeared consistently in their language regardless of the country the account came from. The patient's attention changed. The gaze became fixed at a specific location in the room. The expression shifted, and the nurse's language for this shift was consistent in a way that statistics do not fully capture. Words like peace and relief and something that several nurses reached for and then described as recognition, not just seeing something, recognizing it. The distinction was one the nurses themselves repeatedly drew. They had seen patients look at walls. They had seen patients track nothing across ceilings. This was different, the account said, again and again. The quality of the attention was different. It had the character of greeting. The Indian dataset offered Osis and Haraldson something the American dataset could not provide in quite the same form. A population for whom the cultural content of deathbed visions would, if such content were primarily shaped by cultural expectation, have been substantially different. Hindu concepts of death and the afterlife, Buddhist frameworks, the specific figures expected within each tradition, all of these would, if cultural scripting were the dominant mechanism, have produced a profile of vision content meaningfully distinct from what appeared in accounts from American Christian or secular patients. The researchers found that the differences existed, but that they were smaller and more specific than the model would have predicted. The deceased relative remained the predominant figure across both populations. The emotional quality of the experience, the comforting, welcoming character of the figure described, remained consistent. The specific cultural dress, the specific religious imagery did vary, but the deep structure of the account, the known figure, the welcoming presence, the sense of being accompanied rather than confronted, held across the boundary between the two data sets in a way that Osis and Haraldson documented carefully and did not claim to have explained. There is a specific set of case files from the Indian data, accounts collected from physicians in Bombay, in Madras, in Delhi, that Osis and Haraldson treated as a subset within the subset, cases where the information barrier had been confirmed with particular care, and where the dying patient's identification of the figure had been specific enough to allow independent verification. A patient in Bombay who named a cousin, a physician's notation that the family had confirmed the cousin died 6 weeks prior, a record in the hospital's visiting log showing that no relative had visited the patient in the intervening period. The margin of error in each of these cases was not zero. The researchers did not claim it was zero, but the accumulated weight of the subset, the same structure repeating across different institutions, different countries, different decades, was what Osis and Haraldson brought to the question of ordinary explanation, and set against it, and left there without resolving. When Lady Florence Barrett first wrote down her account of what she had witnessed at Doris's bedside, she did not write it for publication. She wrote it because she was a physician, and she had observed something that she considered professionally relevant and personally significant, and she wrote it in the same medium she used for her other clinical notes, with the same attention to sequence and specificity. The question she appears to have carried from that room was not whether the vision had been real in the philosophical sense. She was careful not to commit herself to a claim that could not be evidentially grounded, but what the surprise had meant. Not the vision, the surprise. The look on Doris's face when she named the person she had not expected to find there. That was the detail that kept its weight. That was the detail that appeared again in Lady Barrett's account when she described the case to Sir William, and again in the published version, and again in the notes she made separately in the years that followed. The same phrase recurring. She appeared not to have expected to see her. A physician's note carries a specific kind of evidential weight that is different from a letter or a memoir. It carries the date and the patient's condition and the attending physician's name and the context of the clinical situation in which the observation was made. It places the account inside a frame of professional accountability. Lady Barrett knew this. The nurses who filled out Osis and Haraldson's survey forms knew this. The physicians in Bombay and Delhi and Madras, who recorded in their own notes what their patients had said to the empty corners of their rooms, knew this. The act of writing it down in a professional medium was itself a claim about the quality of the observation, a statement that the person recording it considered it worth recording in a context where professional credibility attached to everything they put their name beside. The survey questionnaires from the Osis Haraldson study have been preserved. They sit in documented archives. the individual handwritten answers still legible, the different pens in different hands, and different levels of professional comfort with the question, all visible in the ink. Some forms are filled out in confident, consistent script. Some have hesitations in them, second thoughts, crossed out words, longer answers added in smaller writing at the bottom of a box that was almost too short to contain what the person wanted to say. Several nurses added unprompted personal notes in the margins, comments the form had not asked for, observations they apparently felt the question had not quite made room for. One of these marginal notes, from a nurse in an American hospital in 1971, describes the patient who had turned toward the corner of the room and smiled, and adds, in the margin, in a handwriting that has become slightly smaller, as though the nurse was aware of writing outside the designated space, "I have seen people look at walls. This was not that." The specific character of the surprise in these accounts is the thread that pulls through the case of Doris in the 1920s, and the nurse's survey response in the 1970s, and the physician's notation in Bombay. The content of any vision could, in principle, be shaped by expectation, by the culture's framework for what death brings, by the mind's need for comfort, by the neurological processes of a brain under terminal stress, producing imagery drawn from the most emotionally significant material available. A person who expects to see deceased relatives at the moment of death might see them. A person who has been told by their religion or their family or their culture that the dead return to accompany the dying might experience something shaped by that expectation. These are not implausible accounts of how vision content could be produced. Researchers have taken them seriously and will continue to. But the Doris case and the Peak and Darien subset within the Osis Haraldson data are specifically and carefully structured around instances where the expectation would not have predicted what was reported, not where a figure appeared. Where a figure appeared who, according to everything the dying person knew about the world in their final hours, should not have been dead yet. That is the specific evidential claim these cases make, and it is the reason Barrett used the phrase he borrowed from Cobby, and the reason Osis and Haraldson used the same phrase 40 years after Barrett. The phrase carried with it not just an image, but a protocol, the recognition that the most significant detail in this class of account was not the vision itself, but the discrepancy between what the dying person expected to see and what they reported seeing. The Peak in Darien was not remarkable because of what stood upon it. It was remarkable because of what could be seen from it, the vast and unexpected fact of the ocean appearing where no ocean had been anticipated. There is a quality of stillness in the case files that is worth attending to, not the stillness of resolution. None of these cases has been resolved, in the sense of being fully and satisfactorily explained, within a model that accounts for all the details, but the stillness of documents that have been sitting in the same folders for decades, the handwriting unchanged, the dates unmoving, the accounts exactly as they were left by the people who recorded them. The nurse who wrote in the margin in 1971 does not know now that her note has been read and cited. Lady Florence Barrett does not know that her clinical notation from the 1920s is still being examined. The physicians in Bombay and Delhi do not know that their patient records were later incorporated into a retrospective data set that found in them the same pattern the nurses in Kansas City and Ohio had reported independently. The records simply persist, carrying whatever weight they carry, sitting in whatever relationship they sit in, to the question no one has answered. The Osis Haraldson case files from the Peak and Darien subset occupy a specific physical location, They are cross-referenced against hospital admission records, against visiting logs, against the documented communication histories that Osis and Haraldson assembled through years of painstaking independent verification. Each file contains the survey form, the additional correspondence with the reporting physician or nurse, the independent confirmations from family members and hospital administrators, and the notes the researchers themselves made during analysis. Their observations about which information barriers were most firmly documented, which cases had the most specific and verifiable details, which accounts they considered the strongest, and which they treated with more caution. The caution is visible in the files. The researchers did not discard the uncertain cases, but they marked them, and the distinction between the cases they considered most evidentially significant and the cases they held with more reservation is preserved in the archive as part of the record of how the research was actually conducted. What Osis and Haraldson concluded after the full analysis was stated carefully. They did not claim proof of survival. They did not claim that the cases in the Peak and Darien subset established, beyond reasonable doubt, that the figures the dying patients had identified were in any sense literally present. What they claimed was that the cases in this subset, taken together, were not satisfactorily explained by the hypothesis that vision content was entirely a product of the dying person's prior knowledge and cultural expectation. Something in the specific pattern of the surprise, the something that had not been expected, the someone whose presence required information, the patient did not appear to have, resisted the available explanatory frameworks in a way the researchers considered worth documenting precisely and leaving formally open. Sir William Barrett had reached a similar position 30 years earlier, sitting with Lady Barrett's account of Doris and the growing collection of cases he had assembled from correspondence over 2 decades. He had been a physicist. He was comfortable with the idea of an open question. The discomfort he expressed in the notes that accompanied Deathbed Visions was not the discomfort of uncertainty. He was accustomed to uncertainty, but the discomfort of a question whose implications were difficult to hold in any ordinary conceptual framework, wherever the evidence might eventually lead. He filed the cases. He organized them by evidential quality. He published the book and died the following year and left the question exactly where he had found it, open, documented, and worth continuing to examine carefully. The archive that Osis and Haraldson assembled sits as a particular kind of object in the history of this research. It is not a conclusion. It is not an argument for a specific interpretive position. It is a documented record of what physicians and nurses reported witnessing in hospital rooms across 2 countries, cross-referenced against independently verified information barriers, analyzed for patterns by researchers who applied specific evidential criteria to distinguish the more significant cases from the less significant ones, and published in 1977 in a form that remains available for examination. Researchers who have agreed with Osis and Haraldson's interpretation have cited it. Researchers who have disagreed with their interpretation have cited it. Researchers who have set aside the interpretive question entirely and focused on the phenomenological data have cited it. The archive does not compel any particular conclusion. It simply holds what it holds. The survey forms, the marginal notes, the cross-references to hospital records, the specific handwriting of the nurse who wrote that she had seen people look at walls, and that this was not that. The researchers named this category of cases after a title borrowed from a poet's image of standing at a height and seeing something vast and unexpected below. That name passed from Kobe to Barrett to Osis and Haraldson across nearly a century of separate investigations each generation of researchers finding it useful, each returning to it not as a conclusion, but as a description of the specific quality of the cases that resisted explanation. The dying person standing at the edge of something and reporting with surprise a presence that should not have been there by any accounting they had access to. The name persisting, the question persisting with it. The case files from 2 countries, cross-referenced and preserved and still open, sitting in documented archives where researchers a century from now will be able to find them and begin again from where the last careful person stopped. In a research facility outside Dayton, Ohio, in the 1940s, a subject was placed inside a centrifuge designed to expose the human body to forces beyond what flight could ordinarily produce. The chamber was sealed. The acceleration began. Afterward, when the equipment stopped and the subject was returned to ordinary gravity and ordinary air, researchers sat with them and recorded what they described. Not the physical pressure, not the sensation of force, but the things they had seen. The accounts were consistent enough across subjects that they entered the clinical record. Figures appeared at the edges of perception. Colors moved in patterns that meant nothing. Sounds arrived without sources. The experiences were vivid. The subjects agreed on that, but they were also chaotic. They were frightening. They were populated, where they were populated at all, by shapes that refused to resolve into anything familiar. The aerospace medicine researchers filed their notes carefully, and the notes described something the dying patient's family would not have recognized at all. That gap between what oxygen deprivation produces in a pressurized chamber and what appears in the accounts from hospice rooms is where the neuroscience of deathbed visions begins. Not at the point where the science runs out, but at the point where it runs very far and then meets something it was not quite designed to describe. What the research on the dying brain has established is genuinely extensive. What it has not yet established is equally specific, and both of those things are worth holding carefully. The most immediately available explanation for deathbed visions is hypoxia. As the body shuts down, oxygen delivery to the brain decreases. Neurons fire in ways that differ from waking, oxygenated states. The literature on hypoxia-induced altered states goes back decades and draws from multiple research contexts: high-altitude mountaineering, controlled aviation studies, near-drowning recovery accounts, centrifuge research of the kind conducted in those Ohio facilities. What researchers, including Peter Fenwick and Christopher Kerr, have noted when they set this literature beside the hospice accounts is a phenomenological mismatch. The experiences produced by documented hypoxia are consistent with each other. They are fragmented, they are disorienting in quality. They carry a threatening register rather than a peaceful one. The subjects in centrifuge studies and survivors of near-drowning events describe something closer to a disintegration of the familiar world than an arrival within it. The hospice accounts describe something closer to recognition, a room that becomes clearer, a presence that becomes identifiable, a shift in the patient's expression that attending nurses describe as relief. Those are not the same kind of experience. They may originate from overlapping neurological conditions, but they are, in their reported character, different. This does not mean hypoxia is not occurring. In most dying patients, it is occurring. The question the researchers raise is whether hypoxia alone accounts for the specific phenomenological profile of what is reported: the coherence, the peace, the presence of familiar figures, the naming. Hypoxia explains the altered state. It is less clear that it explains the content. A second proposed mechanism comes from the neuroscience of sleep. Kevin Nelson, A neurologist at the University of Kentucky proposed that what he called REM intrusion might account for the vivid imagery reported in near-death and deathbed experiences. The brain, under physiological stress, may allow elements of REM sleep, the stage in which vivid, emotionally charged imagery predominates, to break through into waking consciousness in ways that would not occur in a healthy, unstressed brain. The mechanism Nelson described is real and documented. REM intrusion is the neurological basis of sleep paralysis, among other phenomena. It produces experiences that feel intensely real to the person having them. It occurs more readily in brains that are fatigued, oxygen depleted, or under stress. The difficulty, when this mechanism is placed against the specific character of deathbed accounts, is the same one that arises with hypoxia. What REM intrusion reliably produces in the sleep paralysis literature and in the accounts of those who experience it in other contexts is not peaceful recognition. It is the opposite. Sleep paralysis episodes are characterized in clinical literature by a sense of presence that feels threatening, by visual imagery that is disorienting rather than welcoming, by a register that subjects consistently describe as frightening. The figures that appear are rarely familiar. They are rarely named. They are rarely described afterward as having provided any comfort. Against this, the hospice accounts describe something that the patients themselves consistently distinguish as qualitatively separate from disturbing experiences. The comparison the neuroscientists invite is reasonable. The comparison also has limits that the neuroscientists themselves have acknowledged. What the sleep science framework does illuminate, when it is held beside the deathbed literature, is something about the boundary state of consciousness, the territory between full wakefulness and something else in which these experiences appear to occur. Both phenomena seem to occupy a region of awareness that is not fully one thing or fully another. That observation does not explain why the content of the two types of experience diverges so reliably, but it places them on a shared neurological map, which is itself a kind of progress. In 2010, a research team in Slovenia published a study in the journal Critical Care that offered a different angle. The researchers were studying cardiac arrest survivors, and they found something in the biochemistry that was not what they had expected to find. Patients who reported near-death experiences during cardiac arrest had significantly higher blood carbon dioxide levels at the time of their event than patients who went through cardiac arrest without reporting any anomalous experience. The difference was statistically significant. The researchers took it seriously. Carbon dioxide at elevated levels has documented psychoactive properties. It can produce sensory disturbances, altered states of consciousness, unusual perceptions. The finding was genuine, and the researchers published it carefully, noting what it suggested and what it left open. What it left open was the content. Elevated CO2 can produce altered consciousness. The Slovenian data established a biochemical correlate between elevated CO2 and the likelihood of anomalous experience during cardiac arrest. What neither the Slovenian data nor the broader CO2 literature addresses is why the altered consciousness produced under these conditions takes the specific form of deceased relatives rather than other forms. CO2-induced alterations in consciousness in controlled research settings do not reliably produce encounters with recognizable deceased individuals who speak comforting words and demonstrate knowledge consistent with their relationship to the subject. The biochemistry may be part of the mechanism. It does not fully specify the content that emerges from it. That gap between mechanism and content is where several researchers have focused sustained attention. It is a narrower gap than the one between nothing is happening and something is happening. The neuroscience has established that something is happening in the brain of the dying person. It has established that the brain is not behaving as it does under ordinary waking conditions. What it has not established, with the specificity the deathbed accounts seem to demand, is why that altered brain consistently produces encounters with deceased family members, not strangers, not threatening presences, not the fragmented imagery of oxygen deprivation. The specific people, named, recognized, described with apparent surprise by patients who, in some documented cases, had not known those people were dead. Michael Naum, a German biologist, published a systematic review in the Journal of Near-Death Studies in 2009 that drew attention to a related phenomenon that had been intermittently documented for over a century without being formally named. He called it terminal lucidity. The phenomenon Naum described had been observed by clinicians since at least the early 19th century. Isolated accounts of dying patients who had been severely cognitively impaired, in some cases for years, returning briefly to a state of coherent, oriented, recognizable mental clarity in the hours or days immediately preceding death. The cases Naum documented were drawn from clinical records across multiple countries and periods. Alzheimer's patients who had not recognized family members for years and who in their final hours spoke clearly and knew where they were. Patients with severe dementia who asked for specific people by name. Patients whose neurological deterioration had by clinical assessment progressed well beyond the point where such clarity should have been possible. The cases were documented by physicians who filed them in clinical records without knowing what to make of them, in some instances with explicit notations to the effect that the recovery was inexplicable given the patient's condition. Naum's review assembled these cases and found that the pattern was consistent enough and well enough documented to deserve formal recognition as a distinct clinical phenomenon. What made Naum's review particularly relevant to the study of deathbed visions was what many of the documented cases of terminal lucidity also contained. Not all of them, not with scientific uniformity, but enough that Naum noted it explicitly. In a significant proportion of the cases he reviewed, the returning lucidity arrived alongside the patient's description of a presence in the room, a deceased relative, someone they named, someone they apparently recognized and addressed with the ease of recognition, speaking as though to a person standing close in the same minutes or hours during which their mind had returned from the place their illness had taken it. The neurological puzzle this presents is not a simple one. Terminal lucidity, in Naum's analysis, is difficult to account for under a model in which brain tissue damage is irreversible and progressive. The tissue that had been impaired did not suddenly repair itself, yet the function associated with that tissue, coherent thought, orientation, recognition, language, appeared to return. The mechanism by which this occurs is not established, and the question of whether the visions reported during terminal lucidity are related to whatever neurological event is producing the lucidity itself, or are something that accompanies it without causing it, is a question the 2009 review explicitly left open. Both questions are open. They have been documented as open questions by a researcher who spent years compiling the case material. They remain open in the literature that followed. In palliative medicine, the practical question of what dying patients are experiencing has been approached from a different angle, and that angle has produced its own set of observations that bear on the neurological discussion. Christopher Kerr and colleagues at Hospice Buffalo conducted repeated interviews with terminally ill patients over the course of their care asking specifically about dreams and visions as death approached. The data that emerged from those interviews, published in the Journal of Palliative Medicine in 2014, showed a pattern of increasing vividness and frequency of end-of-life visions as death drew closer. The patients in Kerr's study were not experiencing single anomalous events, and they were experiencing a progression, something that developed over days and weeks, that intensified, that carried emotional meaning the patients articulated clearly. What they articulated clearly repeatedly was the presence of people they had loved and lost. The patients in Kerr's study also made a distinction that appears in the deathbed vision literature, with enough frequency to constitute a finding in itself. They distinguished their end-of-life visions from other experiences. They distinguished them from medication effects. They distinguished them from ordinary dreams. Patients on stable opioid regimens were clear about this. They knew what the medication did to their perception, and they reported the deathbed visions as something different, in kind, rather than in degree, not more vivid, not less controlled, different in their fundamental character, peaceful where the medication-induced experiences were sometimes distressing, coherent where the drug effects were fragmented, populated by specific named, recognizable individuals, where the opioid hallucinations, when they occurred, were populated by unfamiliar or threatening presences. This distinction between opioid-induced hallucinations and deathbed visions has been noted by researchers who study palliative pharmacology as well as by those studying the visions themselves. Studies by Kerr and colleagues, alongside earlier observations by Osis and Haraldson, found that opioid-induced hallucinations in palliative patients tend to carry a distressing quality, fragmented visual content, unfamiliar figures, a threatening register that patients find frightening and that they describe as unpleasant. The patients who also reported deathbed visions, in some cases the same patients, on the same days, described two distinct categories of experience and were consistent in assigning them to those categories. The medication produced one kind of thing, the visions produced another. The patients were clear about which was which, and their clarity was itself, for the researchers, a data point. The palliative pharmacology literature offers something useful here. It establishes that opioid drugs at the doses used in palliative care do not reliably produce experiences that match the phenomenological profile of deathbed visions. They produce something, and what they produce is documented and recognizable. But it is recognizably different from what the patients describe as their deathbed visions. This does not establish that the visions originate outside the brain. It does establish that they do not obviously originate from the drugs. The pharmacological explanation reaches far enough to cover the distressing, fragmented experiences, and then it stops short of the calm, coherent, recognitional ones. What is left after the pharmacological explanation and the hypoxia explanation and the REM intrusion explanation have each been followed to the edge of what they establish is a question about content. Not whether altered neurological states are producing experiences in dying brains. They are, and the research has documented this extensively. The narrower question is why those altered states, across widely varied populations, cultural backgrounds, medical conditions, and pharmaceutical regimens, reliably produce encounters with deceased relatives. Not strangers, not abstract entities, not the fragmented imagery of simple oxygen deprivation. The people the dying person loved, the people the dying person had lost, arriving in the room and being recognized and named. Fenwick's clinical observations, gathered from palliative care nurses across multiple UK hospices and published with Elizabeth Fenwick in The Art of Dying in 2008, describe a specific sequence that nurses reported observing with enough regularity that it had become familiar to them. A patient's gaze would fix at a particular point in the room, upward, often, toward a corner, sometimes. The gaze would hold. The patient's expression would shift, not toward distress, not toward confusion, but toward something the nurses consistently described as recognition. Then the patient would reach, or they would smile, or they would speak a name. Then they would die. Fenwick called what he was documenting the escort phenomenon. The term is descriptive rather than explanatory. It names the pattern without claiming to account for it. The nurses who described these sequences to Fenwick's research team were experienced clinicians. They knew what medication-induced confusion looked like. They knew what the agitation of a dying patient in pain looked like. They knew what the vacancy of severe cognitive impairment looked like. What they were describing to Fenwick was something they distinguished from all of those, something they found difficult to name but easy to recognize once they had seen it, something that arrived in the room and then left it. The neurological framework, at this point in the research, has identified multiple mechanisms that are genuinely relevant. Hypoxia, REM intrusion, CO2 elevation, terminal lucidity. Each of these is documented, each is real, and each reaches toward the deathbed vision phenomenon with genuine explanatory force. What the framework has not yet produced is an account that explains why all of these mechanisms, operating in different patients under different conditions, converge on the same specific content, the same figures, the same relationship, deceased, loved, recognized, the same emotional register, comfort, peace, recognition, rather than dread. The mechanism varies. The content does not vary nearly as much as the mechanism would predict. That is the observation that researchers like Fenwick and Kerr have placed at the center of their published work, not as a mystical claim, but as a clinical and scientific observation. The consistency of the content across cases where the neurological conditions and pharmaceutical environments differ substantially is something that the current mechanistic explanations do not fully account for. The researchers have published this observation in peer-reviewed journals. They have stated it in language that is careful and tentative and specific. They have not claimed to know what it means. They have stated that the explanation is incomplete and that the incompleteness is in a particular place, not in the existence of the altered state, but in the identity of what appears within it. A palliative care room at night, late in the decade of the 1990s, somewhere in a British hospice, a patient lying in the hours that precede death, a nurse completing her rounds in the dim ward. The patient is on stable medication. The patient has been assessed. The nurse knows what the medication does, and she has seen it do it before. Then the patient turns toward the upper corner of the room. The expression that crosses his face is not confusion. It is something the nurse will later describe to a researcher as the look of seeing someone arrive who was expected, or who was almost expected, and whose actual arrival still carries surprise. The patient speaks a name. It is the name of his wife. His wife has been dead for 11 years. The nurse records this in her notes and remains in the room. The patient dies before the ward grows light. What the nurse recorded was what she observed. She did not record an interpretation. She did not record a conclusion. She recorded the sequence, the turn, the expression, the name, the stillness, in the same way she recorded everything else that happened during her shift. And what she recorded went into the data set that researchers were assembling from hospices across Britain and then across the United States, and the data set grew until it contained thousands of such sequences, each recorded by trained clinicians who knew what they were looking at and described, very carefully, what it was not. It was not medication-induced confusion. It was not oxygen deprivation, producing frightening or fragmented content. It was not the kind of dementia-related hallucination that involves threatening or unfamiliar figures. It was something those nurses consistently distinguished from all of those, using the precision of long clinical experience, filing their observations in the same careful places where they filed everything else they had seen and measured and could not fully explain. The 2014 survey by Brain, Farnham, and Fenwick, published in the Journal of Palliative Medicine, gathered the observations of experienced palliative care nurses across multiple institutions and found that the majority reported regularly encountering what the nurses themselves described as qualitatively distinct end-of-life experiences in their patients, regularly, not as rare anomalies, not as isolated events that stood out from their clinical experience because of their rarity, as something they encountered with enough frequency to have developed over their careers a way of recognizing it, a familiarity with the pattern that allowed them to distinguish it from the other things they saw daily, and to describe that distinction in terms specific enough to be clinically useful. What the nurses described in that survey and in others like it included the fixed upward gaze, the visible shift in facial affect, the reaching gesture, the naming of specific people. And the naming mattered because what the patients named in the accounts filed by these nurses across years and institutions was not random. It was not the product of a brain cycling through stored associations without discrimination. It was specific. It was relational. It was the figure the patient would have most wanted to see, in many cases, or the figure they had not expected to see because they had not known that figure was dead. And in those cases, the ones the researchers continue to track across the literature, the ones that place the most specific evidential demands on any proposed explanation, the question the neuroscience reaches toward and does not quite arrive at is the same one it has always been. Not whether the brain is doing something remarkable at the threshold of death. The question is who appears within that remarkable something, and why the dying so consistently know them by name. The case files from the Osis Haraldson research, the Kerr interviews conducted in Buffalo hospice rooms, the British nursing surveys, the Fenwick field observations, all of them are archived. They are specific. They exist in the form of dated records, filled out by clinicians who were trained to observe and record accurately. The content of those records resists easy resolution under each of the neurological frameworks the research has assembled, not because the frameworks are wrong, not because the neuroscience has not reached far enough, but because the neuroscience has established what the dying brain does under stress, and what the dying brain does under stress does not fully predict the particular thing that these patients consistently describe seeing. The mechanism reaches to the edge of the experience. At the edge, there is a figure. The figure has a name. The dying person knows the name. And the neuroscience, having documented all of this with great care, finds itself standing at the edge of what it can fully account for, looking into something it has mapped very precisely and still cannot entirely see. Michael Namm's case files from the Terminal Lucidity Review, the ones that drew from clinical records stretching back into the 19th century, described patient after patient whose illness should have made coherent thought impossible, and who returned to coherence briefly, and who in that brief return described the room around them in terms that included someone standing close. The neurological paradox of terminal lucidity. That function returns in tissue that should have lost its capacity for that function is one the neuroscience has not resolved. The accompanying observation that the patient, in the moment of that return, describes a particular kind of presence is nested inside the neurological paradox rather than separate from it. Both things are happening at once. Both things are documented. Neither is fully explained. The question of what the brain does at the edge of life is a genuine scientific question, and it has received genuine scientific attention. The attention has been careful, and the findings have been published in peer-reviewed contexts, and the researchers involved have been rigorous. What they have established is that the dying brain is not simply shutting down passively. It is doing things, producing experiences, generating content. And that content, across the breadth of the documented research, has a profile that is consistent enough and specific enough and distinct enough from the profiles produced by other known neurological mechanisms that the researchers have filed it separately and kept the file open, not because they know what it contains, because they know what it is not. And between those two things, what they know it is not and what they do not yet know it is, there is a space where the question continues to sit, patient and unresolved, in the careful language of clinical notes that no one has yet found sufficient reason to close. The centrifuge chambers and the hospice rooms are not, in the end, describing the same experience. The aerospace medicine records and the palliative nursing surveys have been held beside each other long enough that the researchers involved are clear about this. What the pressurized chamber produces and what arrives in a quiet room near the end of a long illness are different in their character, different in their content, and different in what they leave the person who has the experience believing about what they saw. One produces fragmentation, the other produces recognition. One produces dread, the other produces something that looks to the nurse standing in the doorway at the end of her shift, and to the researcher sitting with a clipboard in the early morning at Hospice Buffalo, and to the neuropsychiatrist reading through the accounts of experienced clinicians across 30 UK hospices, like the particular and unmistakable expression of someone who has just seen, in a room they were sure held only strangers, a face they have known for a very long time. The neuroscience reaches to that expression and stops there, not because the science is done, because the expression is specific in a way that the mechanisms have not yet learned to predict. The dying brain is somewhere the research has followed carefully and at great length, mapping what it does, measuring what it produces, tracing the biochemistry of the final hours with instruments that grow more sensitive every decade. The mapping is real, and the measurements are real, and the tracing continues. And at the center of the map, in the territory the instruments have reached but not resolved, there is the still and particular fact of a person dying, turning towards something no one else in the room can see, and knowing it by name. A New Kingdom Egyptian papyrus, held now in the collection of a museum that keeps it behind glass in controlled light, shows the deceased standing at a threshold while a figure reaches toward them with one extended hand. The hieratic script runs in dense columns beside the image. The papyrus dates to somewhere between 1550 and 1070 years before the Common Era, a period of more than 4 centuries during which this particular way of depicting what waited at the moment of death was reproduced in tomb after tomb, burial after burial, across the length of the Nile. The figure extending the hand is not a stranger. The gesture is not one of obstruction or judgment. It is, in the visual language of the New Kingdom, the gesture of a familiar presence offering guidance to someone who has just arrived somewhere new. What the funerary texts of ancient Egypt described at the threshold of the duat was a geography of welcome. The deceased was not alone there. The soul, in its passage from the living world, encountered presences it recognized, figures who had crossed before and had returned to meet the one now crossing. The text that Egyptologists gather under the name the Book of Going Forth by Day do not treat this encounter as exceptional or remarkable. They treat it as expected. The papyri were produced in numbers large enough to suggest that this expectation was widely shared, carefully maintained, and considered worth the considerable expense of having it written down and sealed inside a tomb where it would remain undisturbed for the duration of eternity, or until archaeologists arrived with brushes and lamps. This is not a theological claim. The papyri are documents. They describe, in the careful visual and textual language of a literate and organized civilization, what that civilization expected dying people to find. Whether what they expected corresponded to what dying people actually experienced is a question the papyri themselves cannot answer. What they can establish, and what they do establish, is that the expectation existed, that the image of a deceased familiar figure extending a welcoming hand at the moment of death was not an improvised comfort, but a documented cultural fact, reproduced with sufficient consistency over sufficient centuries to constitute a formal record. The record goes further than Egypt. In Tibet, monks trained for years in the text known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Thodol, attributed to the tantric master Padmasambhava in the 8th century of the Common Era, so that they could read it aloud to a person in the final hours of dying. The reading was not ceremonial in a decorative sense. It was instructional. The text told the dying person, in precise and practical language, what they were about to encounter and how to orient themselves toward it. Among the things the Bardo Thodol described were visions of familiar beings, presences from the dying person's own life, people who had already died, appearing in the transitional state between death and what the text called rebirth. The scholars Chogyam Trungpa and Francesca Fremantle, in their study and translation of the Bardo Thodol, noted that the text presupposes these visions will feel intensely real to the one experiencing them. The instruction is not to dismiss the figures as illusory. The instruction is to recognize them, to understand that recognition is itself meaningful, that the appearance of a known face in this particular moment carries information the dying person is meant to receive and respond to. The rooms where this reading took place were lit by butter lamps. The air was close. The monk reading aloud spoke in a low, steady voice, directly to the person dying, using specific language designed to prepare them for a specific kind of encounter. What connects the Egyptian papyrus and the Tibetan reading room is not a shared theology. The two traditions developed across a distance of thousands of miles and several thousand years, with no documented line of influence running from one to the other. What connects them is a shared expectation, precise, instructional, reproduced in texts considered important enough to carry forward across generations, that at the moment of death, the dying person would encounter someone they already knew. The European tradition preserved the same expectation in a different register. In the early decades of the 15th century, the Latin text known as the Ars Moriendi began circulating across Western Europe, a genre of instructional literature on how to die well, produced in two main versions around 1415 and 1450. The Ars Moriendi was practical literature in the tradition of practical literature. It told dying people and those attending them what to expect, what to do, and how to understand what was happening. Among what the dying person was told to expect was the appearance of figures at the deathbed, figures including the souls of deceased loved ones, whose presence was described as comforting and whose appearance was presented as a sign that death was near and that the dying person was not moving through it alone. The historian Philippe Ariès, in his foundational study, The Hour of Our Death, documented the Ars Moriendi tradition as part of a broader history of how dying was organized and understood in Western culture across many centuries. What Arias found in these texts was not the invention of a comforting fiction, but the formalization of a cultural expectation. The deathbed, in the world the Ars Moriendi described, was not empty. It was a space attended by presences that those outside could not see, and the dying person's awareness of those presences was treated in the literature as a reliable sign that death was genuinely close. The woodcut illustrations in surviving manuscript copies show the deathbed crowded with figures, some clearly angelic, others recognizably human in form, depicted as though gathered to receive someone they had been waiting for. These manuscripts survive in European archives. They can be held, the woodcuts can be studied, the text can be read. As cultural artifacts, they document not what happened at the beds of dying people in the 15th century, but what the culture of the 15th century believed happened, and believed consistently, and believed specifically enough to produce illustrated instructional manuals so that the dying and their families would know what to look for and would not be frightened when they found it. The consistency of the expectation across three traditions, separated by geography and time, is itself the thing researchers have found difficult to account for with a single explanation. Each tradition had its own theology, its own formal vocabulary, its own reasons for caring about what happened at death. The Egyptian expectation came from a cosmology in which the soul navigated a specific geography after death, guided by texts and figures who knew the way. The Tibetan expectation came from a cosmology in which consciousness moved through transitional states between rebirths, encountering figures whose nature carried instruction. The European Christian expectation came from a cosmology in which the soul, released from the body, encountered loved ones already in the care of heaven. The theologies are not the same. The figures extending their hands are not drawn from the same iconography, but the structure of the experience the traditions describe is remarkably similar. A known person, recently or long deceased, appearing at the moment of death to the person dying, recognized with apparent clarity, present in a way that shifts the character of the dying person's final moments from distress towards something closer to peace. Into this broad frame of historical documentation, the ethnographic record from the 19th and early 20th centuries adds a layer of observation that carries a different quality of evidence. The observers were not theologians transmitting a sacred tradition. They were field workers, physicians, and clergy recording what they saw and heard in the course of other work, often without a theoretical framework that would explain or organize what they were writing down. Among the Lakota Sioux, ethnographers working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries documented accounts in which dying individuals described receiving visits from relatives who had already died. The accounts were not treated, in the context of the culture where they occurred, as exceptional. They were understood within the Lakota framework of relations between the living and the dead as a recognized feature of dying. What made them notable to the ethnographers recording them was that they fit a pattern: a dying elder turning toward an empty doorway, speaking aloud, naming someone who had died the previous winter. The ethnographer's notebook recorded the words, the name, the date, and the circumstances. The ethnographic literature preserved the account. Similar observations appear in records from the Ojibwe and the Navajo, accounts of dying people in their final hours, addressing presences that others in the room could not see, identifying those presences as deceased family members, speaking to them with the ease of recognition rather than the alarm of hallucination. Researcher Alan Kelleher, in his comparative study of accounts he gathered under the title Visions of Heaven, analyzed these ethnographic records, alongside the clinical data from modern Western hospice research, and found that the phenomenological profile, the nature of the figures reported, the emotional character of the encounter, the timing in relation to death, was consistent across cultural contexts in ways he argued were not reducible to a single shared cultural template. The Lakota elder and the Victorian hospital patient and the Tibetan practitioner of the Bardo Thudol were not working from the same cultural script. They were reporting, within their own frameworks and vocabularies, something that looked, from the outside, like the same experience. The difficulty of this observation is that it resists the most straightforward available explanation that deathbed visions are culturally constructed, that dying people see what their culture has prepared them to see, and that the consistency of the experience within a given tradition is simply evidence of how effectively that tradition has shaped expectations. That explanation is partially available. It accounts for some of what is documented. Dying Victorian Christian would be familiar with the idea that the souls of the dead might appear to the dying. A dying Tibetan Buddhist would be familiar with the Bardo Thudol's instruction about familiar figures in the transitional state. Cultural preparation likely shapes the vocabulary and imagery of these experiences in ways that would be difficult to disentangle from whatever else is occurring. But the cross-cultural consistency runs across traditions where that preparation did not exist, where the dying person had no framework that would lead them to expect this specific kind of encounter, and the phenomenological detail across traditions tends toward the same specific feature. Not a generalized sense of comfort, not a vague presence, but a recognized individual, a face, a name, the particular quality of recognition that is different from encounter, the knowledge not that a stranger is here, but that someone specific, someone known and missed, has arrived. Kelleher's analysis noted that this specificity is itself the anomalous feature. Cultural construction could reasonably produce a general sense of comfort, a general sense of not being alone, a general sense of warmth. It has more difficulty accounting for the consistent and specific detail of the named, recognized, deceased familiar, especially in the subset of cases documented in clinical literature as well as ethnographic record, where the dying person names or describes someone whose death was not known to them at the time. The 19th century British colonial physicians working in India preserved exactly this kind of observation, filed in medical journals and missionary records without the framework of psychical research to organize them. A physician's journal entry from the period, one of many that Carlos Osis and Erlander Haraldson later incorporated into their retrospective analysis, reads in a specific and plain way. The date is recorded, the patient's condition is described. The physician notes that the patient, in the hours before death, turned toward an empty area of the room and began to speak. The patient named someone. The physician noted the name and then added, in the margin, the relevant clinical detail. The person named had died in a previous year. The patient had been ill and confined for a period that made communication about that death unlikely. The physician's marginal note does not theorize, it simply records. These physicians were not, for the most part, writing for an audience interested in psychical research. They were keeping clinical records in the tradition they had been trained in, recording what they observed because they had been taught to observe carefully and write down what they found. The journals where these entries appear were not spiritualist publications. They were professional medical records kept in the ordinary course of a physician's practice. The entries survive not because someone selected them for their anomalous quality, but because medical records are kept, and occasionally someone goes through them. When Osis and Haraldson conducted their retrospective analysis of these 19th century accounts alongside their 20th century survey data, what they found was that the phenomenological profile of the older accounts closely matched the survey responses from physicians and nurses in the United States and India in the 1970s. The figures seen by dying patients in colonial India in the 19th century were, in their essential character, deceased relatives recognized with apparent clarity, perceived as welcoming rather than threatening, indistinguishable from the figures reported by dying patients in American and Indian hospitals a century later. The language differed. The clinical context differed. The cultural frameworks within which the accounts were understood differed considerably. But the core observation, a dying person recognizing a specific deceased individual at the moment of death, appeared in both bodies of evidence with enough consistency that the researchers noted it as a finding that deserved attention. The retrospective analysis had limitations that Osis and Haraldson acknowledged explicitly. The 19th century records were not collected with systematic criteria. The physicians who wrote them were not conducting research. The selection of cases was inevitably shaped by which records had survived, which had been accessible, and which contained the kind of specific observational detail that made them useful for comparison. What the analysis could establish was not a rigorously controlled data set, but a pattern, one that appeared robust enough across a range of sources and contexts to be worth documenting carefully. The pattern appears in other historical archives that were not collected with clinical research in mind. The records of Muslim physicians in medieval Persia, translated and studied by medical historians, contain accounts of dying patients who reported seeing deceased relatives. The records of medieval Christian monasteries include accounts of monks on their deathbeds who described visits from brothers who had died months or years earlier. Japanese historical records from the Heian period include accounts of dying aristocrats who named deceased family members among those present in their final hours. These records come from cultures with entirely distinct frameworks for understanding death and whatever follows it. The specific content of the theological expectation varies enormously. The basic observational report, a dying person recognizing a deceased familiar figure in the final hours of life, remains strikingly consistent across records that have no documentary connection to one another. The consistency is the thing that is difficult to explain away cleanly. If deathbed visions were purely culturally constructed, the content would be expected to vary considerably across cultures, with different cosmologies and different understandings of what death involves. The Egyptian expectation, shaped by the geography of the duat, might produce visions of divine ferrymen or weighing of hearts. The Tibetan expectation, shaped by the Bardo Thadol's instruction, might produce visions of wrathful deities alongside familiar figures. The American Protestant, dying in a hospital bed in 1970, might see angels or Jesus or a generalized heavenly landscape. What the cross-cultural record actually finds, with a consistency that researchers have noted repeatedly, is something more specific and in some ways more modest than any of these cosmologies would predict. The deceased relative, recognized, apparently present, apparently welcoming. That detail, the specificity of a known face, rather than a generic figure from the tradition's cosmology, is what makes the cross-cultural comparison more than a simple observation of shared human comfort-seeking. The Egyptian papyrus prepared the dying for a divine escort. The Bardo Thodol described wrathful and peaceful deities as well as familiar presences. The Ars Moriendi tradition included angelic figures alongside human souls. But what dying people across cultures consistently report in the accounts that survive from each tradition is most often the human and the specific. A mother, a husband, a brother who died 3 years ago, recognized by name and by face in the hours before the dying person's own death. Kelleher's comparative work attempted to hold this observation without resolving it into a conclusion it cannot yet support. What the cross-cultural record establishes, he argued, is not a universal metaphysical truth, but an empirical pattern, one documented across enough separate contexts, with enough internal consistency in its phenomenological detail that it demands a careful explanation rather than a casual one. The explanation might ultimately be neurological, or psychological, or cultural in ways that are more subtle than simple cultural construction. It might involve several of these factors in combination. It might involve something that current frameworks have not yet adequately described. What it cannot reasonably be, given the breadth and consistency of the record, is an artifact of a single cultural tradition or a product of a single historical moment. The oldest records and the most recent clinical observations share a feature that crosses the distance between them without requiring any connection. The figure seen is not a stranger. In the Egyptian papyrus, the guiding presence is one who knew the deceased. In the Tibetan instruction, the familiar beings are named as such because they are familiar, because the dying person will recognize them, and that recognition is the point. In the Ars Moriendi, the souls of loved ones appear specifically because they are the souls of loved ones. Known, missed, their presence a particular comfort rather than a general one. In the Lakota Elder's account, recorded in a field notebook in pencil, the names spoken toward the empty doorway are the names of people who had died the previous winter and who were apparently recognizable to the person who would join them before the season turned again. The colonial physician who wrote down what his patients said in those final hours did not attempt to explain it. He was a practical man with a journal and a duty to record what he observed, and what he observed was a dying person speaking with apparent recognition to someone who was not visible to anyone else in the room. He wrote down the name. He wrote down the date of the named person's prior death, which he had confirmed from records. He noted that the patient had been isolated from outside communication for a sufficient period to make knowledge of that death unlikely. And then he filed the journal among his other clinical records, where it remained. What the physician did not do, and what the monks who read the Bardo Thodel aloud to the dying did not do, and what the embalmers who sealed the papyri into tombs did not do, was discard the observation because it was inconvenient or inexplicable. Across a remarkable range of traditions, in a remarkable range of historical periods, the consistent response to the observation that dying people appeared to recognize deceased individuals at the moment of death was to write it down. The specific frameworks into which the observation was filed varied enormously. The Egyptian cosmological framework and the Tibetan Buddhist framework and the medieval European Christian framework and the colonial physician's clinical journal are not the same kind of document, but they share the impulse to record, to take the observation seriously enough to preserve it, to pass it forward in some form, to give the person who comes later the chance to read it and notice the pattern. The pattern, held across all of these records together, looks like this. A person is dying. In the final hours or days, that person appears to perceive a presence that others in the room cannot see. The presence is identified as a specific deceased individual, someone known to the dying person, recognized with what appears to be genuine recognition rather than confusion or fear. The dying person's emotional state shifts in accounts across cultural contexts, from distress towards something quieter, and then the dying person dies. The records do not agree on what this means. The Egyptian papyrus and the Tibetan text and the Ars Moriendi manuscript and the colonial physician's journal would each place this observation within a different framework of meaning. What they agree on is the observation itself, that something like this happens, that it is worth recording, and that the recorded account is worth keeping. The physician who wrote the marginal note, the name, the date of the prior death, the observation that his patient had been confined and unlikely to have received word of it, did not throw the journal away. He kept it with his other records, in the ordinary way that a conscientious physician keeps records, and it remained there through whatever came next in his life and practice, through whatever happened to his effects after his death, through whatever institutional or archival process preserved it long enough for researchers a century later to find it and recognize, in the careful plainness of his notation, the same observation that had been made in a Tibetan reading room lit by butter lamps, in a New Kingdom Egyptian tomb sealed against the desert, in a 15th century manuscript produced for dying people who were told, in precise instructional language, what they were likely to see. He wrote down what his patient said. He wrote down the name. He wrote down the relevant clinical detail that made the naming notable, and then he set the journal aside and went on with his day, and the account remained, quiet and specific, in the archive where it waited. The researchers who found it a century later placed it alongside other accounts from other archives, accounts from traditions that had never read each other's texts, from cultures that had never compared their frameworks for understanding death, from historical moments separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles. And what they found when they looked at all of these records together was not evidence for any single interpretation of what dying people are experiencing in those final hours. What they found was a pattern, persistent and specific, that crossed every available boundary of culture and time and remained, at its core, the same: a dying person, a recognized face, a name spoken aloud to someone only the dying person could see. The colonial physician filed his journal. The monks copied the Bardo Thadal across centuries. The embalmers sealed the papyri in the dark. The ethnographer wrote the account in pencil in a field notebook beside the Lakota elder's words. Each of these records was kept in the ordinary way that important things are kept, not because any single person knew the full scope of what they were preserving, but because the observation seemed worth writing down, and writing things down seemed worth doing carefully. The journal is still there, wherever it is kept now, in whatever archive holds the clinical records of a colonial physician who died in the ordinary way that everyone dies, and whose patient's final words he thought worth noting, in the margin, in his plain and careful hand. At 49 Marlowe's Road in London, in a building that still stands, there is an archive. The questionnaires are bound and catalogued. They were filled out in thousands of different hands across 4 countries between 1889 and 1894, some in the careful copperplate of a professional, some in the cramped pencil of a working person who had been asked to describe something they had never spoken of before, some in the shaking script of someone very old, recording an experience they had carried for decades without anyone asking. The pages are real. The ink has not faded entirely. And the question that produced them sent out across Britain, France, Germany, and the United States by a group of scholars who believed that certain reported experiences were worth examining carefully before being dismissed. That question has not been answered in any of the years since the questionnaires were bound and set on their shelf. The Society for Psychical Research was founded in 1882 by Henry Sidgwick, Frederic Myers, and Edmund Gurney, and from its earliest years it operated according to a principle that distinguished it from both believers and debunkers, that systematic collection and careful evidential analysis was a prior obligation before any interpretive conclusion could be reached. Between 1889 and 1894, acting on this principle, the Society conducted what it called the Census of Hallucinations, a structured survey of approximately 17,000 individuals across 4 countries. The census asked a specific question: had the respondent ever, while awake and in full possession of their faculties, experienced the vivid impression of seeing, hearing, or being touched by a person or object that was not physically present? Within the large body of responses that came back, a statistically significant subset described experiences involving individuals who were at the time of the reported experience dying elsewhere or recently dead. People the percipient had had no conventional means of knowing were gone. The results were published in 1894 in the Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research. They have not been satisfactorily explained. Before the census, the Society's founders had already turned their attention to a related body of material. Edmund Gurney, Frederic Myers, and Frank Podmore spent years collecting and analyzing accounts of apparitions, what witnesses described seeing in connection with deaths, crises, and the final hours of individuals they knew. In 1886, they published Phantasms of the Living, a 2-volume work that brought together over 700 cases. These were not gathered from spiritualist meetings or popular fiction. They came from physicians, military officers, clergymen, teachers, and ordinary households, and each case was evaluated against a defined set of evidential criteria: corroboration, documentation of the information barrier, independent confirmation of the death or crisis event. Among the cases Myers classified as veridical hallucinations were those in which a dying individual reported seeing a person who had recently died in circumstances where the patient's isolation from news of that death could be independently confirmed. The case number would be written in, the names of corroborating witnesses, the date, and in some entries in Myers's own hand, the word verified placed beside the notation that the information barrier had held and that the figure named by the dying patient had indeed died before the patient spoke the name. The work of those early years established a template that later researchers, decades removed, would return to without always knowing they were returning to it. The practice of confirming information barriers, the practice of cross-referencing patient accounts against independent records, the insistence that the interesting detail was not the vision itself, but the specific content, not that a dying person saw a figure, but that the figure they saw was someone already dead, someone whose death they could not have known. This is the thread that runs through the entire documentary record. It was present in the cases Gurney and Myers collected in the 1880s. It was present in Cauby's earlier compilation, and it was still present, still being carefully documented in the hospice rooms and research interviews of the 20th and 21st centuries. In the winter of 2011, a researcher sat beside a patient's bed at Hospice Buffalo in New York, a clipboard in hand, a recording device on the bedside table with the patient's permission. The interview was one of many in a longitudinal study being conducted by Dr. Christopher Kerr, and it was part of a design that distinguished this research from earlier retrospective work. Rather than asking families and nurses to recall what patients had described, Kerr's team asked the patients themselves, repeatedly, across the days and weeks leading to death. The patient in the room that morning described a figure seen at the foot of the bed the previous evening. The description was specific. The figure was identified. The researcher wrote the notes in real time, in ink, and the account joined the accumulating data set from 59 terminally ill patients who had each agreed to be interviewed at regular intervals for as long as they were able. Kerr's study, published in the Journal of Palliative Medicine in 2014, found that 88% of the patients interviewed reported at least one end-of-life dream or vision before death. The experiences were not distributed randomly across the dying process. Pure fantasy, they increased in frequency as death approached. They increased in vividness, and they were populated consistently and predominantly by deceased family members, figures who appeared in scenarios that patients most often described as comforting, welcoming, and distinctly unlike the confusion or distress associated with medication effects. The figure at the foot of the bed was not threatening. The figure at the foot of the bed was someone the patient had known well and had not seen for years, and whose arrival felt, as patient after patient across the dataset described it, like the correct thing, like something that had been arranged, like recognition rather than apparition. The dataset that came out of Hospice Buffalo did not resolve the question of what these experiences were or where they originated. Kerr and his colleagues were precise on this point. What the data established was the phenomenology, the consistent character of the experiences, the pattern of their timing, the specificity of their content. What the data could not establish, within its own frame, was the nature of the mechanism. The figures at the foot of the bed might be the brain's own production, a tissue of memory and neurological event assembled at the edge of shutdown. They might be something else. The study did not declare either way. What it declared was that the experiences were real to the patients who had them, consistent across a diverse population, distinguishable from confusion or drug effect by the patients themselves, and increasing rather than fading as the moment of death drew near. Dr. Peter Fenwick had been working with similar material from the British hospice system for years before Kerr's study appeared. Fenwick, a neuropsychiatrist at King's College London, had come to this research through a long career in clinical neuroscience. He was not a credulous observer, and his approach to the material was shaped by decades of empirical discipline. What brought him to the hospice accounts was the consistency. Working with Elizabeth Fenwick, he gathered accounts from palliative care nurses across multiple hospices in the United Kingdom, asking them to describe in detail what they had observed in dying patients in the final hours of life. The pattern that emerged from those accounts had a specific reproducible structure that Fenwick came to call the escort phenomenon. A patient in the last minutes of life would turn. The head would move toward a specific location in the room, a corner, an area near the ceiling, a point near the door. The gaze would fix. There would be a visible shift in the patient's expression, a change from the features associated with distress or the blankness associated with near unconsciousness to something that the nurses consistently described as recognition or joy, or the specific relaxation of someone who has seen something expected. Sometimes the patient would speak, sometimes only move toward the figure, arms reaching or hand extending, and then the stillness would come. Fenwick and Elizabeth Fenwick published these accounts and his analysis of them in The Art of Dying in 2008, naming and documenting the phenomenon as precisely as the material allowed. The accounts held a consistent shape across institutions, patients, and nurses. The shape was not explained by the clinical parameters. Each nurse who contributed to Fenwick's research had also seen other things: the confusion of encephalopathy, the distress of opioid-induced hallucination, the restlessness that attends fever or organic brain disturbance. They knew what those looked like. They had seen them many times. What they described to Fenwick's team was something they consistently distinguished from all of those, and the distinction was not sentimental, it was clinical. The escort phenomenon had a recognizable character that experienced nurses placed in a separate category from medication effect or neurological deterioration, not because they had a theory about it, but because the features were different in ways they could specify. The calm was different. The coherence was different. The directionality of the patient's attention, focused and purposeful, rather than wandering or reactive, was different. They wrote this into the record. Fenwick wrote it into his analysis. The analysis did not arrive at a resolution because the material did not permit one. In 2014, a survey by Brain, Farnham, and Fenwick, published in the Journal of Palliative Medicine, extended this inquiry to a broader population of palliative care nurses. The majority of those surveyed reported regularly encountering patients who described seeing or speaking with deceased relatives in the final days of life. Regularly, not as a rarity they might recall across a career, but as a consistent feature of the dying process they witnessed in their clinical work. The nurses surveyed were not spiritualists or advocates for a particular interpretation. They were professionals describing what their patients did and said, and a consistent feature of their descriptions was the distinction they drew between these accounts and the accounts that accompanied delirium or pharmacological disturbance. The deathbed vision came calmly. The patients who had them could often describe them with a specificity and coherence that disappeared in genuine confusion. The patients themselves, on stable medication regimens, would often note the difference unprompted. This was different from the other things, they would say. This was real. The distinction is not trivial. It sits at the center of a difficulty that every serious researcher in this field has had to navigate. The dying brain is not functioning normally. It is under physiological stress. It is frequently receiving opioid analgesics. Oxygen delivery may be compromised. The conditions that produce genuine hallucination, frightening, fragmented, populated by unfamiliar or threatening figures, are clinically present. Any account from a dying patient must be read against that background. What makes the deathbed vision accounts difficult to set aside is precisely that the patients set them aside themselves, distinguishing what they saw in the corner of the room from what they saw when the medication produced its own imagery. The distinction comes from the patients, not from the researchers. The researchers are recording a difference the patients are reporting. This thread of careful recording runs back further than most of the modern literature acknowledges. The Society for Psychical Research in the 1880s and 1890s was already committed to the same basic evidential practice, gathering accounts from multiple independent witnesses, confirming information barriers, distinguishing what could be corroborated from what could not. Edmund Gurney's case notations and Phantasms of the Living carry the same methodological instinct that would later appear in Kerr's longitudinal interviews and Fenwick's nursing surveys. The instinct that the interesting detail must be pinned down as specifically as possible, the corroborating witnesses named, the barriers confirmed, the accounts set against the record. The archive at 49 Marlowe's Road holds the earliest layer of this work. The journals that published Kerr and Fenwick hold the most recent. Between them lies over a century of accumulating documentation that has not been resolved in either direction. There is a case in the Fenwick archive from a palliative care nurse in a hospice in the south of England, recorded in the early 2000s, that carries the particular quietness of the whole body of material. She had been nursing for many years. She had worked in the hospice long enough that she had seen the dying process hundreds of times and had learned to read its stages with the accuracy of long experience. She described a patient an elderly woman who had been unresponsive for most of the previous 24 hours, who in the final hour of her life opened her eyes, turned her head toward the upper left corner of the room, and held that position with a stillness of attention that the nurse recognized immediately as different from the random eye movement of the semi-conscious. The woman's expression changed. She lifted one hand from the blanket. She spoke a name. The name was her husband's. He had died 4 years earlier. She had not spoken at all in the preceding day. After speaking the name, she lay back, and she died in the next several minutes, peacefully, with the particular quality of stillness that the nurse, in the account she gave Fenwick's team, could only describe as resolved. The nurse wrote this into her account and added it to the data set. Fenwick's team cross-referenced it against the case's medical notes. The patient had received no information about her husband in the period of her hospice care that would have made him a prominent figure in her conscious attention. She was not medicated at a level associated with hallucinatory effects. She had been unresponsive for most of a day before she opened her eyes and turned toward the corner. The account was documented, filed, and added to the archive of similar accounts from nurses across different institutions who had witnessed the same sequence: the turning, the recognition, the name, the stillness. None of these accounts individually resolves the question. Together, they constitute a pattern that the research literature acknowledges as genuine, consistent, and not yet explained. Part of what the long documentary record reveals is that the question itself has shown remarkable stability. The cases collected by the Society for Psychical Research in the 1880s asked, in essence, the same question that Kerr's longitudinal interviews were asking in 2011, not whether the dying saw figures, but who those figures were and under what evidential conditions. The shift from the Victorian era to the contemporary clinical setting is not a shift in the core question. It is a refinement of method, more rigorous protocols for confirming information barriers, more systematic cross-referencing against medical records, more structured interview approaches that reduce the retrospective distortion of memory. The question remains the form it always was. What is it that the dying see? Why do they consistently see people who are dead? Why are those people so often people whose deaths the dying patient could not have known about? Within the Ossis and Haraldson dataset from the 1970s, the approximately 1,700 physician and nurse accounts gathered from the United States and India, there is a subset the researchers themselves named explicitly, drawing on a metaphor that had been coined nearly a century before. They called these the Peak and Darien cases, after the title of the essay in which Francis Power Cobb had first collected accounts of this specific type. Dying patients who expressed surprised recognition upon seeing a figure they had not expected to find among the welcoming presences, surprise, because the figure they saw had only recently died, and that death had been deliberately concealed from them. The naming was not incidental. It was an acknowledgement of lineage. The researchers in 1977 recognized that what they were documenting in hospital rooms in Bombay and New York was the same pattern that Cabé had documented in Victorian households, and that the pattern had persisted across 95 years of social and medical change without becoming easier to explain. These cases are the evidentially sharpest in the entire body of literature. A dying patient who sees a recently deceased relative whose death has been concealed is not drawing on known information. There is no conventional mechanism by which they could know, and yet the accounts exist, distributed across cultures, centuries, and research programs, carrying the same specific feature, the surprise. The patient does not simply see a figure among the welcoming presences and accept the figure presence as expected. The patient registers something unexpected. The expression shifts. The words that follow contain a recognition that carries its own emotional content. "Why are you here?" the dying person says. Or, "I did not know you were here." Or a name spoken with a particular surprise that the family members and nurses standing at the bedside recognize as genuine and unexpected. This is what the researchers documented. This is what sits in the case files and has not been resolved. The AWARE study, conducted by Dr. Sam Parnia at Southampton University Hospital, approached the question from a different angle and with a different methodological anchor. Parnia's research was a prospective study designed to test whether the reports of out-of-body experience during cardiac arrest, reports in which patients described observing the resuscitation room from a position above or outside their own body, could be verified against physical evidence. To this end, Parnia's team positioned visual targets on high shelves in resuscitation rooms, placed at angles that made them visible only from above, images that could not be seen by any person standing or lying in the ordinary positions of the room, but that would have been visible to someone perceiving from the location that out-of-body experiencers most commonly described. The targets were specific images. They were documented. They were in place. The study ran for years. The case file remains formally active in published literature, its methodology carefully described, and its conclusions drawn conservatively. Some cardiac arrest patients reported experiences consistent with awareness during resuscitation. The target methodology produced insufficient verifiable data to confirm or deny visual perception from above. The target sits on its shelf. The case remains open. What the AWARE study shares with the Census of Hallucinations and the Kerr longitudinal study and the Fenwick Hospice Nurse surveys is the same fundamental quality, a disciplined, precise attempt to set the question of deathbed experience and dying perception within a frame of verifiable criteria, and the willingness to document that the frame has not yet produced a resolution. This is not a failure of the research. It is the character of the material. The cases that populate the various data sets across the full history of systematic inquiry in this area are not cases that cry out for explanation and receive none through inattention or ideological resistance. They are cases that have been subjected to considerable attention and have remained genuinely unresolved at the specific points that matter most. Not whether the dying see figures, but who the figures are and how the identity of the figures is known. In the archive at 49 Marlowe's Road, among the thousands of Census of Hallucinations questionnaires filled in across 4 countries in the final decade of the 19th century, there are accounts from people who wrote them down in the particular silence of someone reporting something they had not told anyone. The handwriting sometimes changes partway through an account, grows smaller or more careful, as though the writer became aware, mid-sentence, of the weight of what they were recording. Some accounts run long, spilling past the margins of the questionnaire form onto separate pages included in the envelope. Some are very brief, a date, a name, a sentence, describing what had been seen, and then a full stop, as though the writer had said everything and had nothing further to offer interpretation. These accounts were collected, cataloged, analyzed, and published. They were then added to the archive and held there for researchers who would come later. The researchers came later. Gurney and Myers had already been collecting for years by the time the census questionnaires began arriving. After them came Osis and Haraldson, gathering physician accounts from 2 countries and finding that the pattern the Victorian researchers had documented had not changed in the intervening century. After them came Kerr, sitting beside beds in a hospice in Buffalo with a clipboard and a recorder, hearing from dying patients about the figures at the foot of the bed, writing it all down in real time. After Kerr came the nursing surveys, the hospice databases, the prospective cardiac arrest studies with their visual targets on high shelves. Each layer of research added to the archive. None of it closed the question. All of it refined the shape of the question, pressing it toward the specific and away from the vague, insisting on the particular features, the information barriers, the surprised recognition, the consistent identity of the figures as deceased rather than living, the calm rather than distress that make the body of material difficult to set aside and difficult to resolve. What the long record establishes is a practice rather than a conclusion, a practice of documentation, a practice of cross-reference and verification, a practice of sitting with the patient in the last hours and writing down carefully what they say without rushing to an explanation and without refusing to take the account seriously. This practice has been maintained for over a century by researchers who differed considerably in their theoretical orientations, some inclined toward survival hypotheses, some toward neurological explanations, some willing to sit at the midpoint without committing to either shore. What they shared was the practice itself, the writing down, the cross-referencing, the keeping of the files. In the hospice room that the palliative care nurse described to Fenwick's team, the elderly woman turned toward the upper left corner of the room and spoke her husband's name. That moment lasted a few seconds. The nurse recorded it carefully, added it to the account she sent to Fenwick's researchers, and it was filed. The woman died in the minutes that followed. The nurse returned to her other patients. The account traveled from the hospice to the researcher's desk to the published literature to the archive, where it rests with thousands of other accounts from nurses and physicians and family members who sat beside the dying and wrote down what they witnessed. What is collected in those archives is not proof of anything beyond its own occurrence. The accounts exist. They describe a consistent pattern. The pattern has been documented across a long period of time, across cultures and institutions and methodological frameworks, and it has not been satisfactorily accounted for by any single explanatory model. The neurological proposals reach far and account for much. They do not account for the specific figures, the identity of who is seen, the circumstances under which information about those figures was unavailable to the patient, the quality of surprise that appears when the figure is someone the patient had not known to be dead. That specific detail persists in the record, from the Victorian case files to the contemporary hospice nursing surveys, unchanged in its essential character and still without a resolution. The visual target in the AWARE study sits on its shelf in a resuscitation room in a hospital in Southampton. It has been there through many cardiac arrest events. It is a specific image, documented, photographed, placed precisely to be visible only from above. The patients who have been resuscitated in that room and have reported out-of-body experiences have been interviewed and their accounts recorded. The data so far has not confirmed that the target was perceived from above. It has not confirmed that it was not. The case file is listed as ongoing in the published literature. The researchers who designed the study chose a methodology that would produce a clear result if perception from above occurred and was described. It has not yet produced that result. The study continues, or its methods continue to inform subsequent work, and the shelf holds the target. This is the condition of the research, not a failure of nerve or a suppression of evidence, but the honest shape of a question that has been held open carefully for a very long time. The case files are thick, the data sets are large, the pattern of the phenomenon is well documented, and the question that the pattern poses, what it means that the dying so consistently see the recently dead, see them with recognition, see them with an apparent knowledge of their presence that conventional channels cannot account for. That question has not been answered in the literature, and the researchers who know the literature best tend to be the most careful about saying so. The archive at 49 Marlowe's Road is open to researchers. The questionnaires in their binding are accessible.